Oh.
There we go.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on National Register nominations and the importance of context and comparative analysis in establishing significance. I'm Betsy Friedberg. I'm the National Register Director at the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and I'd like to introduce the two other people who you see on your screen this morning. Our speaker, Lisa Deline, is an architectural historian and the National Register reviewer at the National Park Service, responsible for reviewing nominations from Massachusetts, as well as 5 other Eastern states. She's been active in the field of historic preservation for more than 25 years. Lisa has been with the National Register program for more than 13 years, and she's been reviewing Massachusetts nominations since 2018. Also with us today is my colleague, Ben Haley, who's preservation planner and the National Register assistant for Massachusetts. Lisa will speak for about 25 or 30 minutes about what makes the most successful National Register nominations, and then she welcomes your questions. A housekeeping note, your questions must be presented in writing through the Q&A box on your screen. Please drop your questions into the Q&A section on the Zoom screen rather than in the chat box, and don't raise your hand. Just put them in writing into the Q&A, and Ben and I will be monitoring your questions. And now I'd like to turn the screen over to Lisa. Thank you so much, Lisa, and welcome.
Thank you. I'll turn off the video here and I will share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Good morning. I'm so happy to speak with you today about the National Register, and thank you all for the work you do in saving historic places. I normally give this talk as a half-day workshop, so it was a challenge paring it down to a 30-minute webinar. There's a lot that I cover. Today, we'll focus on Section 8 of the National Register nomination form and talk about why historic contexts are an essential part of National Register documentation. I will also briefly touch upon the historic integrity aspects and how they can help support your arguments that are made in Section 8, which is the Statement of Significance narrative. Preservation Massachusetts has made available examples of some of the properties I will talk about today to help illustrate key points. Additional sample nominations are available by contacting staff at the Massachusetts State Historic Preservation Office or by visiting our National Register webpage.
Lisa, just a quick note. Either your presentation's frozen or it's not in presentation mode.
Okay, let's look. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. As you know, we list properties under criteria A, B, C, and D, and the areas of significance under these criteria will all require the development of a solid historic context or theme in order to understand the significance of the nominated property. I'll focus mainly on criterion A properties or those associated with the broad patterns of our history. While a majority of nominations are listed under criterion C, which is mainly architecture, we often find National Register preparers adding criterion A as a way to beef up a nomination without fully developing a historic context to understand how the resource has made a significant contribution to our history. Popular areas of significance under this criterion include commerce, industry, community planning and development, social history, and ethnic heritage. So is there some mysterious plot afoot at the National Park Service to ruin the lives of consultants and preservation office staff? Do we in Washington get some thrill in devising new and onerous requirements? No, contexts are not new. This does not mean that nominations all need to be graduate level dissertations or only researched and written by professional historians. The goal we are seeking is the successful nomination, whether it be for the National Register, determinations of eligibility, Part 1 tax certifications, or for a National Historic Landmark. What is the best way to please a National Register reviewer? Context, context, context. You have an example of this nomination for the Consolidated Fruit Auction Company in Cleveland that's online at this conference. And this is the building pictured here. It's a very well-developed context under the area of commerce. So you can provide me with the worst looking dog of a building, but if that nomination contains a solid historic context and a comparative analysis that I can understand, then we can proceed to listing. Without a context, lack of context is one of the primary reasons for nomination returns. Properties do not exist in a vacuum. Understanding resources and understanding their significance fundamentally rests in understanding the theme in which they were built and in which they now exist. Lack of context means no placement of the resource within a locational or temporal framework. We call it the "it is what it is" problem, where the preparer writes statements of facts or just repeats the property description versus writing statements of significance about the property, the why a property is important under the area of significance. For example, the property is a 2-story, 4-bay house with red shutters. That is statement of facts. With versus, during a rapid economic growth period, 2-story, 4-bay houses with red shutters were the most common way for wealthy businessmen to convey their wealth and represented a huge change from the 1-story cottages without shutters that marked the community before this growth period. With the loss of the local industrial economy, there are few such resources left to convey this boom era change, and these buildings best illustrate this theme. This is explaining why the red shutter houses are significant. What is a historic context? These are the component pieces. It's not only the historic theme, the framework for understanding the significance, but also the history of the resource within this framework during a specific time, the period of significance, and within the geographical area in which it stands, the level of significance. We have a National Register bulletin that covers these aspects, how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation, and it's found on our website. An example that's available for you today is the Quincy Grammar School in Boston. In this case, the historic context is the resources associated with the Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans in the city of Boston. The history of the resource, the significance of the Quincy Grammar School within this overall framework specifically zeroes in on the areas of education, social history, ethnic heritage, and architecture during the period of significance, 1848 to 1976, and within the city of Boston. So the level of significance is local. Is context important? Yes. It provides a background for understanding why a property exists. Every property is associated with something somewhere. Your job is to explain why it rises above the others for some reason to make the case for eligibility. It provides a basis to understand why a property was constructed, when it was, and also provides a basis for comparing. Every property is associated with some theme, somehow, and somewhere. But caution, Not all properties associated with a historic context are automatically significant. For example, not all federal-style houses built during the early 19th century are automatically eligible. A well-developed context makes the case. Your job is to show why this particular example is significant and goes beyond that "it is what it is" statement of facts. Why are there issues? Perhaps the concept is not understood. First-time nomination preparers may misunderstand the history or historical theme. For example, an owner may spend hours tracing the deed to a property or listing every store owner in a commercial building, thinking that that's what's needed. Or there's too much detailed information, or the kitchen sink approach to presenting history that's not synthesized, which can obscure the real history and the significance of the property. Or a preparer may make too many assumptions regarding what's local, state, or nationally significant. Or perhaps there's an aesthetic bias. We were all spoiled by these earlier nominations with glam, high-style architecture. Obviously, it's a Queen Anne style house. It's designed by an architect. Just get it listed. We all know the history behind this style. Or just get it listed as soon as possible. It's a tax project. Hurry up and list it. The National Register is a standalone program. You take your chances if a property is not National Register listed first. Tax projects can be denied when the nomination comes in later and the case for significance cannot be made. So why all the fuss about context? The emphasis is on demonstrating sufficient information is available to make an informed historical judgment about significance. National Register nominations are considered planning tools. Our evaluations and judgments are not just whims, but often have to stand up to legal scrutiny, political scrutiny, and serve as educational resources. They should not be based on personal knowledge or preferences. Preparers can fall into the trap of assuming that everybody knows what they know about a resource or a particular historical theme, either from their in-depth research or because it's assumed to be common knowledge, either locally or within the state. For example, well, of course, the shoe industry was important to Massachusetts. Everybody knows that. The public audience reading a Massachusetts nomination is not necessarily tuned to the same information. Nominations, to some extent, are blank slates. This is not saying that every nomination needs to recite the entire history of the community from Indian settlement to the Vietnam War, but it needs to be a basis for understanding the geographical area, the time, and history relative to the site in question. Again, a property does not exist in a vacuum. So let's get to work on this problem. Where do we start? These steps are outlined in our National Register Bulletin Guidance. It all starts with that all-important summary paragraph that sets the stage for Section 8. You establish the context, the history of the theme, and the resource at whatever level of significance is appropriate. Then the period of significance and the areas of significance are tied directly to the significance of the historic resource. Here I would like to add a warning against the arbitrary use of the 50-year cutoff mark for ending periods of significance. The period of significance is based upon the time when the property made the significant contributions. So logically ending an ending period slightly beyond 1971, which is the current 50-year mark, is fine. We find this oftentimes with commercial districts where the commercial downtown district died in the early 70s once suburban malls took over. So if it's a little more wiggle room of ending at 74, 73, that's fine. However, if several years have passed, then the preparer must demonstrate exceptional importance. There has to be a rationale for your ending period of significance. What's not always needed, the entire history of community or the genealogy of the owners. Extraneous details or history can always be placed under a separate heading at the end of section 8 labeled additional history. Common issues to be aware of. A good introductory paragraph can often make up for a rambling nomination narrative. There's a great benefit to taking the time to prepare a succinct introduction that sets the stage for arguing the property's significance. We get calls all the time from reporters and government officials wanting to know about a listed property and why it's significant. Use this paragraph for your press releases and for social media promotion. This is your go-to paragraph. Be careful not to confuse function versus significance. The function of a city hall, department store, or school doesn't equate to areas of significance. A good nomination will explain why and how these properties are significant. Areas of significance. We see problems with areas that are not supported in subsequent paragraphs. Rather, that kitchen sink approach for the reader to figure out importance, or worse yet, it simply repeats the section 7 property architectural descriptions. We often find aspects of integrity that convey significance are missing. The key aspects of a property should be emphasized to support your case for significance. Now, a property doesn't need to retain all 7 aspects of integrity. However, it should retain the specific aspects of integrity that are paramount for a property to convey its significance. Does the property relate directly to the level of significance and time period? Is there a comparative analysis within the historic context with other similar properties? It's not eligible merely because it's an example of something, some style, function, association, but it's based on surveys. How does this property compare? Avoid the "it is what it is" situation. Nothing exists in isolation, and there may be other similar examples. Too much information. Focus on a context sufficient to evaluate significance. The complete history of the property or the community is not needed. Again, can always place extraneous history under additional heading, under a heading called additional history at the end of section 8. We find this often when you have preparers that are homeowners or let's say a particular church, and they want to list all the names of their pastors that have served in the church. Again, if it's relevant to the significance, that's one thing, but we don't need to have the names and the years served for these people with the church. Nominations submitted under multiple property covers that don't refer to the cover document. Or we also have periods of significance that are not explained or justified. The period must be tied to the areas of significance. So to quickly summarize what's needed in section 8, all important introductory paragraph, a brief synopsis of what we are going to expect in the development of this context and the history you will provide. Background history, keep it brief. Sufficient context to understand the property, not arbitrary, but based on the themes, period, and property types. Geographic parameters tied to significance. And for the property boundaries, we not only need to know what was happening inside the boundaries, but also outside and why. This explanation can also be part of the boundary justification in section 10 of the nomination form. Time, period of significance does not need to equal entire context period, nor is it necessarily tied to the life of an owner, but it does need to relate to the specific resource. Development of the theme with supporting paragraphs to the degree necessary. the who, what, where, why, and when. You are preparing a case. You are, in a sense, arguing for how a property or a district meets the National Register criteria. Emphasize the physical characteristics and integrity of the property. These are the tools used to make a professional evaluation of the property, what we know compared to similar properties out there. And the bibliography, be as specific as possible, not a general reading list, but to aid future researchers. The National Register examples available to you to download today will illustrate all of these points I've made. I also want to note that National Register nominations are housed at the National Archives, and all will eventually be made available to the public. As nomination preparers, be mindful of presentation and the professional look of a nomination, and be careful of any sensitive information that should be restricted. You'd actually be amazed at the odd photographs that we get sent in by the public with their nominations. We love having pictures of dogs. We don't necessarily need the pictures of the grandchildren. So where can we go to find context? There's existing contexts, our NHL, the National Historic Landmark Theme Studies, particularly the new ones, all are listed online. We have ones for labor, desegregation, Asian American history, all well-developed with well-developed registration requirements. Multiple property submissions, we have them for local, state, and national level examples. The one example that's available on our webpage is the Historic Residential Suburbs cover document. And it provides an overall national context on suburban development. It was written to make the listing of neighborhoods and subdivisions easier. And we also have an entire bulletin on suburbs. There are more sample National Register nominations on our webpage. And of course, always ask your State Historic Preservation Office staff for assistance. Now, in the remaining time, I wanted to just briefly talk about one of the handouts. I'm not going to go into specifics because some of you may not have had a time to download it. But the one I'd like you to look at is, in particular, is the one on the James Pepper Distillery in Lexington, Kentucky. This one does a good job developing the Section 8 framework to understand the significance of this property. The historic context is the bourbon production in Lexington, Kentucky, and the handout outlines the 10 strengths found in Section 8 of this nomination. There's a summary paragraph that sets the stage for the bourbon industry, but specifically the post-21st Amendment version of this industry. It's a comparative analysis with other Lexington distilleries during a specific time, 1865 to 1958, in a specific area. It's a local area of Lexington. It has an additional contextual history that focuses on the national political context of Prohibition, and it has additional history of the company and key family members, and it's brief. Also, other samples that are available with this session that you can download we already talked about the Consolidated Fruit Auction Company in Cleveland, good overall context development. Another one is the Edmonton Heights Historic District in Alabama, a residential neighborhood with community planning and development. We've talked about the Quincy Grammar School for social history, ethnic heritage education. And another good example is the Aiken County Hospital in South Carolina. It's significant for health and medicine, government, and architecture. A really good, succinct nomination that covers all the key points in Section 8. Lastly, I have a sample that I usually spend more time talking about in these webinars and my workshops, but it's an example of that it is what it is type resource. It's an example of a house that is a Dutch colonial revival, but the way it is presented, it stands out. It makes the case for significance based on survey data within this town of Marshville, Wisconsin. So look at it, look at the slide and the highlights I've made in my text to illustrate how it is different than just another example of a colonial revival or a Dutch colonial revival style architecture. Lastly, I wanted to add some additional tips on what National Register reviewers like to see in nominations. A strong summary paragraph plus those supporting paragraphs for each area of significance you are claiming. Let us know what you're talking about in section 8. Avoid the kitchen sink approach. Whenever possible, consider nominating historic districts where the focus is on exterior integrity and more properties can be listed versus individual nominations where the property requires a higher degree of both interior and exterior integrity. Organize the developmental history when framing the property within the context. Use headings to organize by decades or major events throughout the period of significance. For example, with downtowns under commerce, what happened to the downtown during the Depression, World War II, post-war, or organize this history by decades. Just helps the reader read through the material. And define integrity. In section 7, the property description, explain how the property conveys the 7 aspects of integrity. In section 8, you explain why these aspects are important and support significance. And with that, thank you for your time and attention. We've covered a lot. And are there any questions?
There are a couple of questions in the chat, Lisa.
Okay, I'm going to start my share.
I'll start with the first one, which is it's a 2-part question, so I'll ask the first part first. In the past couple of years, there's been a push, and you mentioned it briefly in the slideshow. There's a push to nominate districts as opposed to individual properties where possible. Can you explain why that is?
Well, more properties can get listed. A lot of times, getting back to even those aspects of integrity where you're talking about location, setting, feeling, association. If you're talking about, let's say, an industrial building and it's located in an industrial area with other industrial historic properties, making an industrial district may be an easier way to convey that sense of that industrial section of town. A neighborhood is a key one. If you have one house that's one particular style of architecture, but the whole block is the same style, it reads as a neighborhood. You've got a higher bar to make if you're going to do individual. That's why I'm saying with interior and exterior integrity versus how does it work together as a neighborhood? That is its significance. And you have more wiggle room in your documentation. So I'm not saying it has to be a hard and fast rule, but I also don't want to see the next year we have another nomination come right in for the house next door when it could have been a district nomination.
So the other part of this question is, there have been several properties found individually eligible by NPS staff in Part 1 tax certifications, and then after the nomination has been reviewed by the SHPO and submitted, are found not individually eligible and the nominations returned. So can you explain the disagreement among NPS staff as to individual eligibility and if there can be better coordination in the future?
Right. We've actually tackled that issue about a year ago, 2 years ago, because there was a change in reviewers, but there was also not a clarity. And, you know, some mistakes were made. But that's, again, getting back to let's get more properties listed and make the case. And you're right. I don't know, when I saw the reviews of some of these and saw there was like no interior integrity, that's a real red flag. We want to get these properties listed. We want to make it, we want to make as many properties that are eligible listed on the National Register. But you know, we have to make those decisions. And I think we are improving that because we're coordinating better. There's a different tax reviewer now, so we're coordinating those efforts better.
And And then a question, sort of a question slash comment based on what you had said about how a building may not be wonderful on its own, but the context can make it eligible. And I think this is coming from a preservation planning concern in places where this might not be understood or there might be disagreement. So the question is basically the building itself need not have major architectural significance. Maybe it's not the best example of something, but it can be, if not possibly mediocre, if not just the not as remarkable as another one, but being supported through a historic context could potentially make something like that eligible, I suppose.
Right. And that's why I included that example of that consolidated fruit company. I mean, you look at this little building and you're like, that it makes the case, it makes a great case because of the context it's placed in. So, and, I wanted to make it clear that you don't have to have all 7 aspects of integrity, but the key ones are there. And for something that's a warehouse or industrial, I like to see the feeling, the association, the materials to some extent. You need to talk about how it really conveys either an industrial or commercial aspects that add to its significance, but it's not necessarily has to be always the architectural gem with high style features. So it's using the integrity that helps convey its significance to your benefit in your statement of significance. So look at those samples. I think that'll give you a really good idea about particularly that one of how they developed a context where you're like, there was a lot of great stuff that happened at this building.
We didn't get to this part, and it's a big discussion, but someone asked if you could speak, just even briefly about updating a nomination, possibly adding areas of significance. For instance, many properties might be eligible under civil rights, for instance, but they weren't nominated for that. And do you have any guidance on possibly the best ways to update a nomination?
We always encourage amending nominations. You look at some of these older ones and they were, we learn new things all the time. So it's like, or, it was only something that we could do at that particular time. So please, if you feel like you want to amend a nomination, we welcome that. I will say that in November, the National Trust is going to have a whole session, and one of our other staffers, Jim Gabbert, is giving a talk specific to amending nominations. So you can mark that on your calendar as well. It's at the National Trust Conference. So, but getting back to that, yes, we're looking at nominations, we're adding areas of significance, and we're also, working within, broadening the period of significance and adding additional areas of significance. That's done quite a lot. So by all means, work with Ben and Betsy at the State Preservation Office to what is needed to amend a nomination. And sometimes it's just submitting additional continuation sheets that are added to the already listed nomination.
There's another question. This might be a bigger question than here because I think it involves MHC as well. But how do consultants resolve discrepancies between what a SHPO might require for an NR and what perhaps the Park Service expects one to have or what they want? For instance, if the SHPO in their review asks for certain things, but the NR staff at the Park Service wants something else, a consultant can be caught in the middle there. And I don't know if that's something you can answer, but I think it might have to do with how states, states are the intermediaries here with the National Register program, and they may have their own kind of management models, and they might be certain things they'd like to see as nominations having a life beyond just the listing process. And that doesn't mean include all the genealogy of a family, but there might be benefits to including certain things that might not be all that's needed to establish significance, right? So you might only need two paragraphs to establish significance under commerce for something, but thinking about the life of the document long beyond the listing, it might be useful to have more information in there for preservation planning purposes. So I don't know, do you agree with that, or?
Well, I agree with having, again, I can't stress enough that nominations are beginning more and more to be considered planning tools. So, make sure you're making your case for, significance, but again, use that additional history or documentation or context, whatever you want to label it, but also we have which is stated in our bulletins, what we're looking for a good nomination. But also in our bulletin guidance, there is a section that says, and any additional requirements from your state historic preservation office. So that caveat is like, then, if you have certain requirements within Massachusetts, that needs to be included as well. So we look at it for what we're looking for the bulletin guidance, but if Massachusetts has something additionally that they need, that's something that you have the right to ask for as a preservation office. Does that make sense? Or am I getting it right, Ben? What am I understanding it right?
Yeah, that's sort of what, yeah. And then this is maybe something to send to attendees after, but this is this talk is mostly focused on section 8 because we're talking about context and comparative analysis.
Mhm.
But someone asked if you could share any good examples of section 7 for specifically well-organized ones for districts. We can also do that. MHC can do that as well, but so I don't know if there's a different state, if you have anything pops into mind, but otherwise I think we can share that. But I don't know who posted that. It's anonymous. So
yeah. Well, it's just, I guess I differ. There's two different ways of doing it. And if you read Bulletin 16, the how to fill out the form, it talks about, you can either do, what I don't like is to have the focus of section 7 so much, almost like an inventory, where there's pages and pages of inventory. I even saw one time where they even told what the occupations of the people that lived in the house were. I mean, it's just too much information that's not needed for a description. There's also other states that do a very overall general idea of the district. They do, they really get the setting and the feeling and the association where they're describing the district. And then they utilize what, for contributing or non-contributing, they utilize maps where they just mark contributing or non-contributing, or they put it all in an Excel chart as an appendix at the end. So you get a snapshot of just reading the general narrative description in section 7 versus getting bogged down. So I think it needs to have a balance. I don't have a problem with listing the addresses and descriptions of every house. But sometimes, if that's what's needed, and again, a lot of times that's the preference from your state preservation office, that's fine. I want a balance. I don't want an extensive, exhausted one that just has information that may not be necessary to have a description of the property. So there are sample nominations on our webpage, but yeah, I can work with you, Ben, on getting some more up-to-date ones that illustrate each of these versions.
Okay. And then how should one, this person asked how should a SHPO, but I think it could be, or the Park Service, how should one handle nominations in a situation where the historical record could lead to a few interpretations or suppositions? And is it okay to make suppositions or to extrapolate upon previous evidence when there are gaps in the historical record in the situation where you're trying to make a case for significance?
I guess I would need a little bit more information about what specifics they're referring to. And again, you can always, especially I see this done for archaeology, if you have a sense that there could be significance under archaeology, you don't have to claim criterion D, but you can say, evidence shows there's a high degree of potential for answering questions, archaeological questions. And so you can always put that as a placeholder in a nomination to come back as information becomes available to amend a nomination and as that becomes available. So I guess I would need to know specifics of this question that they're asking.
Mm-hmm. There aren't other questions, but I just wondered, I just had a kind of a broad question. I think it's something that comes up from time to time. I wondered, and you did sort of mention it in your talk, but I wondered if you could it's sort of a vague hypothetical, but in a case where something might not be the best representative example of something, whether it's, one of 10 Dutch colonials or one of 10 federal farmhouses. But how could you go about building an argument for a building, for example, that's, a typical example of a style or type, but maybe not the best example?
Again,
and that's such a broad question, but that is a question people do ask.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize the need for survey to keep surveys up to date so you can see what's out there. So, and that's when you look at, the integrity levels of certain houses. And let's use, federal style, and you have 10 federal styles, if it could be done in a district for, that's one way of handling it, but not everyone may be eligible. So it's making the case. Now, when you do that survey and that comparative analysis, you could find details that would be useful to emphasize. For example, a lot of times it may be the last remaining one. It may be the most exceptional out of looking at all those. It may be the most detailed and finely crafted. So those are the evaluation through the survey that you as a professional can analyze these properties and then making a judgment based on what you're finding. So I guess, again, it would have to be a specific, but that's where, instead of just saying it's a federal style, therefore it's significant, we need a little more detail to understand how that fits. Why is that important? And, unless we have some specifics, but I just want to get away with not, because it's Queen Anne style, it's listed. That's what was done in the past, and that's what we're getting away from, to have a little more analysis and rationale for the decision.
Well, and I think too, it's also possible if it's one of 10 identical 2-story, center hall, federal style buildings, and they're all like pretty nice, but maybe you don't know what the interiors look like in all of them. You don't know, but there may be a way to list it. If you can't make the significance for architectural significance, you may want to dive in and see what you can find for something under criterion A or B. Maybe it was some significant person's house. Maybe it was related to some kind of commerce or agriculture. So there are non-architectural arguments to make as well.
Yeah, that's very true. And that's why it's easy to use architecture as an example. I will say in some cases like this, I would really like to see a local multiple cover nomination for, federal style within this period, within that town, so that it's an easier way to list these properties. So that's another option. Are we running out of time?
We have a couple minutes left. We have one question where, what are examples of context? I don't know why I'm getting feedback. What are examples of context when significance relates to a person?
Okay.
Did you hear that?
No. Why are we getting feedback?
I think
I can ask it if.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. Shall I repeat it?
Yes.
Okay, so the question was, can you give an example of context where significance is related to a person?
Yeah, we have a really good one where I'm getting a lot of feedback.
Yeah, I am too.
I don't know. Why don't I submit a sample?
Oh, there we go. I think it was Betsy's mic. You're okay now.
Okay. Well, we have this quite a bit. We have lots of good examples where, for example, a particular person was significant for creating a medical clinic in their town. We had one recently, a couple of years ago, which was an African-American. She was the first African-American doctor in an area, and we listed her office. And so it was significant under medicine and health, but also for her work and under women's history. So we have many examples we have inventors, and they're significant for an invention or industry, and it's tied to the criterion B. So B has to be, is a significant person, but the A argument usually, if they're not architects, but the A argument is what they were significant in. So if you need a more current example of that, I'll be happy to supply that to Ben and Betsy to use. There should be some examples on our National Register webpage, our sample nominations. We have a lot of dated ones there. The information's still valid. We're updating it as we speak. So keep watching for newer nominations, but we do have significant person examples on that page.
Great. There are no other questions in the chat. I don't have any questions. Betsy?
Oh, turn your mic on, Betsy. Do you want to say anything further, Betsy? We have a few more minutes, I think.
Ben needs to unmute.
No, you're unmuted.
Oh, now I'm unmuted. Okay. It looks like there's one more question. If we do have additional time, I'll read it. Major exterior design significant elements may not be reflected in interior features, doorway widths, for example, that may make reuse for public impossible because of accessibility. Sometimes these items stop reuse and make buildings vulnerable. I would say that's more of a comment than a question. So I don't know if there's anything you would want to say about it. We do make an effort to identify all interior features that retain integrity in the description, which is often a question that we're asking for more information about when we work with preparers.
Correct. So yeah, I think you've answered it.
Okay. And a quick question about period of significance, where sometimes we get nominations where there's a separate period of significance for each area of significance, and others where we have done a blanket period of significance. Can you comment on that briefly?
Getting feedback again. So you can do that if it's for architecture, and you can say this is the period where the architecture is, but the building is also significance for commerce, and it has a broad or a commercial district. You can have separate periods of significance, but they all have to fall within the period of significance. So, if one of your criteria fits mostly, you find this a lot too with archaeology. Obviously, it's an earlier period of significance oftentimes, and then later development has a broader period of significance. So you can have two periods of significance. So it's just how you clarify it. If you are putting it in the box on the form, feel free to just further explain it in section 8, why you're identifying these different periods of significance. But the resource all has to fall within your period of significance that you're talking about, that you're working for you're making the case for significance.
Great. Well, we have run out of time. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for the questions.
Yeah. Any other questions, just email me or contact the group in Massachusetts, and we will be happy to answer any further questions.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.